The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
2 in 5 Canadians are expected to develop cancer in their lifetimes. What's not expected is for it to happen when they're not yet 50 years old. Tonight, what a new report shows about early-onset cancer and why a diagnosis in younger patients presents particular challenges. Then, Nam Kiwanuka finds out why some folks are leaving Ontario for points east and west in this country. It's Tuesday, November 22nd, and that's next on The Agenda. Since the 1990s, cancer rates among people under 50 years old around the world have been on the rise. That according to a new report that outlines some of the risk factors and, most worrying, asks the question, is early onset cancer an emerging global epidemic? With us now to find out more about cancer in younger people, let's welcome in Boston, Massachusetts, one of the authors of that report, Timothy Rebick, professor of cancer prevention at the Harvard University's T.H. Chan School of Public Health and a professor of medical oncology at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. In Calgary, Alberta, Michelle Butterfield, senior national online journalist at Global News. And here in the downtown core of Ontario's capital city, Dr. Abha Gupta, medical director of the Adolescent and Young Adult Oncology Program at University Health Network. And we're happy to have the three of you with us tonight here on TVO to tackle a subject that is difficult, but sadly timely. And Timothy, I want to start with you because you're part of the team at Harvard that published that recent report on early onset cancer. Let's just start there and make sure we all understand what we're talking about. Define early onset cancer. What does it mean?
The way we used this definition was by 50 years of age, and we did that only because it's easier to make that comparison. But I think the important point is that cancers are being diagnosed earlier and earlier across a lot of different tumor sites. And so we're not necessarily talking about a specific age. We're just talking about cancers that are diagnosed at an early age compared to what we're used to seeing, which is usually later onset cancers.
And a quick follow-up for you. Do you believe that there is an emerging global epidemic for cancer among younger adults now?
Well, there's no question that the rates of cancer diagnosed in younger individuals is increasing for many cancer types. I don't know that we'll call it an epidemic just yet. It's not COVID, but it is certainly something that is worrisome and something that we need to think about because it has changed very rapidly over the recent decades.
Abha Gupta, we've got you at Princess Margaret Hospital right now, which is, of course, the major cancer treatment center in all of Canada, but certainly here in Southern Ontario. What's your understanding of whether we're into a very unhappy trend as it relates to early onset cancer?
Yes, I think that there's many issues here. One is, as has been mentioned, in terms of the rising awareness and incidence of cancer, but also how young people are able to cope with their cancer journey. And this is really what makes them unique and sets people who are young diagnosed apart from their older individuals who are diagnosed with cancer, for whom it may be less unexpected, let's say in their 7th or 8th decade of life, compared to when one is younger.
If there's more of this happening to more and more younger people, Abha Gupta, can you tell me what that does to the ability to sort of provide resources for the healthcare system as a whole?
Yes, thank you. So, for example, those diagnosed under the age of 39 represent only 10% of the total adult cancer population. And all of those individuals are obviously seen in an adult cancer system, which is overwhelmed by the total volume of cancer patients. However, we know from years of research and our own experience that young people who are diagnosed with cancer do need dedicated programming in order to address their needs, some of which are unique to their age. These include things such as preserving fertility before their cancer treatment begins. Sometimes there's disruption to their early stage career or transition to post-secondary education or thereafter, which also needs specific attention. Finally, being diagnosed with advanced or incurable cancer also is a very special topic and definitely portends to dedicated attention, programming, and resources.
Now, Michelle, you're a journalist. Of course, you cover this story, but this is more than a story for you. This is certainly more than just another story for you. Tell us why.
100%. I was diagnosed with cancer when I was 37 years old. And then a year later, I was diagnosed with a second cancer. So yeah, I'm very familiar with cancer in young adults.
You were in your 30s when this happened to you?
Yeah, I was 37 years old. I had a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old at home at the time.
Oh, wow.
Even Dr. Gupta just said, oh, wow, which prompts the follow-up for me. How the hell did you get through it all?
That's a really good question. I was really, really lucky. I have a really strong support system, great friends, great family, great neighbors, but it was not easy at all. I think it really lends to the conversation that we don't have a lot of support for young people, right? The needs that I had were really different than what someone, for instance, in their 60s or 70s would have. And it was tough. But yeah, we were just very lucky and blessed to have a really great support system on our side.
And again, I don't want to invade your privacy too much here. You've been good enough to join us here for this discussion. So if you don't want to answer any of these questions, you just tell me so. But the two cancers, were they two different cancers in two different parts of your body?
So first of all, I'm an open book. Don't worry about invading my privacy. I'm pretty open with all of this stuff. So I was diagnosed with two different breast cancers. So the first cancer I was diagnosed with was called invasive ductal carcinoma, and it's the most common breast cancer. The second cancer that I was diagnosed with was called Paget's disease of the breast, and it's a really unknown type of cancer. A lot of breast cancer patients don't even know that this cancer exists. I've been told it's diagnosed very irregularly, especially in younger women. And I had that cancer the entire time I went through my first cancer diagnosis, and no one would listen to me. I was breastfeeding when I was diagnosed with cancer, and my son was a biter at the time. So there were symptoms that are common with Paget's, but are also common in breastfeeding. So I was going through that diagnosis, that first diagnosis, and I said, this isn't right, this isn't right. And they said, no, it's a symptom of the chemotherapy, it's a symptom of the surgery, it's a symptom of the radiation, you're unable to heal. That's why these symptoms keep popping up. And it wasn't until I finished my treatment about 6 months later that the symptom wouldn't go away, and I had to demand a biopsy. And about a week later, I was diagnosed with that second cancer.
My goodness. Timothy, I saw you nodding your head during the course of Michelle's telling her story there. Do I take it this is not an unfamiliar situation for you?
Well, it's not a common situation, certainly. I think that the reason I was nodding my head is because it's really difficult when these unusual cancers arise at an early age, concomitant with other things going on, like childbearing and breastfeeding. That the symptoms that might be seen outside of these other situations, would have been detected, would have been followed up. And I think that a lot of clinicians don't necessarily look for things outside of what they're familiar with. And so the story is not unfamiliar. The situation obviously isn't very common.
But can you follow up on that in this regard? There are people, and I guess Michelle's a great example of this here, there are people who can sense when something is wrong, and they can tell that the official explanation they've been given just doesn't ring true. How much of that's going on in your view?
Yeah, I'm so sorry to hear about your story, first of all. And definitely when a young person notices an ache or pain or something different, cancer is definitely not the first thing that anybody would consider. For example, somebody would have a pain in their shoulder, one would attribute that to anything except for cancer. And, in your story, for example, it's surprising that you had to go through that distress of knowing something was wrong, or after you've already been through a cancer experience. So I'm so sorry to hear that. But for those who are just embarking on the cancer system, absolutely, I think that it is difficult for primary care physicians to think of cancer compared to the general population, it would be a rare occurrence. However, I personally think that this goes back to being able to have a good family physician, access to primary health care, and a team that actually gets to know you very well, so that if there is something wrong with your body, then they have something prior to kind of go back to.
Yeah, Michelle, maybe you could help fill in some of the blanks there. How did you have a sense that it wasn't whatever the official explanation of the day was, and was in fact something much more serious?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So like I mentioned, I was breastfeeding my son, and I kept getting what I thought was mastitis, and it likely was mastitis. Mastitis is a infection that develops really quickly when you're nursing, and it just comes from blocked milk ducts within your breast. So it was producing kind of a hard lump-like area, and the problem with mastitis is the onset is so very fast that it's difficult to get in with your primary care physician right away. So I was going to walk-in clinics and being seen by mostly male doctors, and they're a little bit hesitant to maybe do a breast exam. They would just give me a prescription for antibiotics and leave. And finally, on my third bout of mastitis in about 3 months, my doctor just said, "You need to stop nursing your son. This isn't healthy. You can't be going on antibiotics this often." So that was fine. I stopped nursing. And then a few months later, I was on vacation, and I was just noticing my swimsuit was rubbing against where that lump had been, and it just felt really uncomfortable. And I noticed that that lump hadn't gotten any softer. And that's when I prompted myself to make an appointment to go to my doctor. We did a breast exam, and even she said at that time, it doesn't feel like anything funny, but let's send you for a mammogram and an ultrasound. And the amazing thing is that on my mammogram, I had a 5-centimeter tumor. That's quite large, but it didn't show up on my mammogram at all. It was only when I had the ultrasound that they could see that tissue had changed within there, and then I was sent for a biopsy.
Abba, can you tell us whether, when somebody is diagnosed with cancer in their 30s versus if you're in your 70s or 80s, whether there is an approach to treatment that is essentially the same or very different?
Yes, great question. I would answer that in two different parts. It is possible that the actual chemotherapy or treatment recipes are similar depending on what cancer one has. However, there is increasing attention and awareness to the actual biological differences in the tumors, which may then lead to, you could say, personalized medicine or tweaks to that cancer treatment plan. But secondly, as kind of I mentioned previously, the treatment paradigm that complements the chemotherapy in the form of supportive care, both for the patient and for their family members, their partners, their children, their parents, I think is an integral part of ensuring that their cancer journey is smooth.
Can I infer from that, though, that if somebody's in their 30s, you're going to take a much more aggressive approach to treating them than someone in their 80s who, for example, might not be able to withstand surgery, for example?
Well, you could say 80s, then you 70 now. So it's, I don't want to seem ageist, but I think that what we do need to recognize is that there's definitely biological differences. For example, in Michelle, who had premenopausal breast cancer, compared to, a woman who has breast cancer when they're postmenopausal or later in life. And there are definitely, in breast cancer specifically, many treatment differences depending on age. In other types of cancers, absolutely, you're right to say that a young person would likely be able to tolerate much more aggressive interventions such as surgery or more intensive chemotherapy compared to somebody who might be 40 years their senior. Absolutely.
Okay. Timothy Rebick, I want to read an excerpt from your report right now and then get you to comment on it. And here we go. that there is increasing incidence of early onset cancers in several organs, such as colorectal and pancreatic cancers, which might not be fully explained by screening, is also apparent. This trend could reflect increased risk factor exposures in early life and/or young adulthood. Just that segment there that I read, what does that tell us that we sort of didn't already know?
Well, I think first of all, we have changed our protocols for screening. We're often screening individuals earlier for cancers, and that might detect a little bit of cancer sooner, right? If you don't start screening breast cancer or colon cancer until 50, you're going to miss those cancers under 50. So the question is that really the explanation for these earlier onset cancers? And we think not. We think that there are more global trends that are associated with exposures and lifestyle. Interestingly, the majority of cancers that we see increasing in early onset are digestive cancers. And it's interesting to imagine that things that we know are happening in society, changes in lifestyle, changes in physical activity, and changes to diet and nutrition could be actually affecting people earlier than they used to be, particularly because obesity and diabetes and some of those factors are increasing in younger individuals. And so we're thinking that maybe there's a global trend in early onset cancers because of changes to lifestyle and diet. And also, this is probably a reflection of some of the other things that are going on. We know inflammatory bowel disease, diabetes, other diseases that are associated with these kinds of exposures are also increasing. So cancer is one of probably many health effects of changes in lifestyle.
Michelle, since you said your life is an open book, I'm going to keep opening that book. So here we go.
Sure.
What kind of treatment did you have in order to get yourself cancer-free?
So I underwent 8 rounds of radiation, and then I had a lumpectomy surgery as my first surgery, and then I did 33 rounds, so that's daily, of low-dose radiation to the breast and chest area. And then my second cancer was a single mastectomy cancer. A single mastectomy surgery.
How long did all of that take, that entire regimen?
About 2 years in total. Yeah, it was long. It was long. The second surgery wasn't nearly as difficult. I didn't have to undergo any chemotherapy or radiation after that. So I would say my first bout with cancer, it took about 11 months, beginning to end.
And you've anticipated my next question, which basically, once you've recovered and gone through the whole recovery process, do you ever feel like you did before? Like, do you feel normal at all ever again?
That's a really loaded question. It's difficult to say. Physically, I'm almost 4 years out from chemotherapy and all of that, and I'm starting to feel more normal. I think there's a lot of side effects that do linger, and it's really cancer specific and treatment specific. I suffered a lot with brain fog and memory issues. A lot of people have range of motion issues or other physical disabilities or even invisible disabilities. But I would say, a lot of people think the treatment ends and that's the end of it. I would say 100% it's the emotional aspect of cancer, the psychosocial aspect of cancer that's the most difficult. And, I think about cancer less now. It's been 4 years since my initial diagnosis, but I don't think that I'll ever really be free from that. It was a really big thing in my life, a very traumatic event, and I'm healing from it, but I don't think I'll ever be able to completely walk away from it.
And I presume you're going in for regular scans now. How often does that happen?
Actually, no, they don't typically scan. I go every 6 months to see my oncologist, but other than that, unless I have a complaint or something, they don't do any sort of exploratory medicine in that way. They don't do any CT scans or MRIs. I don't get blood work even. I just talk to my oncologist every 6 months, and that's kind of it. How
do you feel right now?
I feel good. I feel really good. I am doing great. Like I said earlier, it's really difficult. October was Breast Cancer Awareness Month, which always brings up complicated feelings. But I've really tried to make good things happen from my cancer diagnosis. I started a support group for young women in Southern Alberta. We're over 200 women strong, all living with or beyond breast cancer. I do a lot of advocacy work in the breast cancer space as well, too. And I just finished up a big series with Global News, an 8-part series discussing the issues that young people face when going through a young cancer diagnosis.
Good for you. That's wonderful. Abba, maybe we could pick up from where Michelle left off, in as much as there are unique challenges that people in their 30s who get cancer or younger face that perhaps people in their, I don't want to sound ageist here, but people in their 70s and 80s don't face. Can you talk to us about some of that?
Yes, absolutely. I think that Michelle touched on a very important aspect, actually, of being diagnosed with cancer as a young person, which is survivorship. And how does one lead their lives beyond the cancer journey? You know, I think of my young patients as warriors who entered a war and kind of came out as heroes. And as you use the word trauma to describe your journey, and I would kind of echo that from all of the individuals that I've spoken to. You know, I think that having your whole life ahead of you still beyond cancer is really what sets this apart, because you have to figure out, how do I overcome the trauma that I experienced in my past with the cancer, its treatment, its diagnosis, fear of cancer recurrence, but also continue to, you know, follow my career dreams, my family, and all those other roles that are still ahead of you.
Timothy, you having done this report with Harvard, and we now have more information about this than we had before, what would you like to see emerge as a result of this additional information that we now have?
Well, I think we learned from, from the report that the clinical community, a lot of the people out there, don't really appreciate early onset cancer. They're just, as we just heard, that there's a lot of people out there whose symptoms, whose situation is poo-pooed rather than followed up upon. And that's something that we need to educate both the clinical community as well as the patient, the general community, so that people who are at risk of cancer, people who may have cancers or symptoms, advocate. As we just heard, you know, she advocated for herself and made something happen, and probably saved her life as a result of that. And people won't advocate for themselves if they don't understand that they should be following up on their symptoms. They should be questioning their doctor's decisions. They should be understanding that there may be something more going on than what the doctor sort of expects to see. And as cancers in younger people are more and more common, we really need to make sure that people are educated and clinicians are educated to look for these symptoms.
Do you worry about the converse effect happening, namely that the minute anybody who's young and gets a pain, their immediate thought will be to leap to cancer, when probably in most cases that's not going to be the case?
Well, that's where the education comes in. We need to have people understand what the symptoms are that they need to be concerned about. We need to have the clinicians understand when there's something that might be cancer, not an ache or pain. This education needs to happen, and it really hasn't, because people are not familiar with early onset cancer. They're not familiar with the symptoms, and as a result, they either underdiagnose or intervene. I don't know that there's too much over-intervention at this point, but proper education about what's going on as younger people are more diagnosed with cancer more is really critical.
Gotcha. Michelle, I want to circle back to something we talked about a moment ago, where you talked about living with cancer and whether you'll ever be able to think of yourself not associated with that disease. And I want to pull a quote here from something that you wrote. Here we go. Here comes the quote. "What I didn't know was living with cancer in my body would be less distressing than living life as a cancer survivor. My hair grew back, signaling to the outside world that I was, quote unquote, better. But that couldn't be further from the truth. I will never fully shed this disease, no matter how long I remain in remission." I guess I want to know, Michelle, whether you can, I mean, that's pretty categorical, what you just wrote there. And I wonder whether you ever do imagine a day where you'll get up in the morning and this won't be one of the first things that you think about.
I'm really hopeful that that's the case, but the type of cancer, the type of breast cancer that I had, it has a really high recurrence rate. A lot of people say that it's going to come back within the first 5 years, if it's going to come back at all. But, you never walk away from that. You never walk away knowing that you're cancer free for the rest of your life. It's either something else is going to kill me or it's going to be cancer, and I won't know until that happens. I think I'm hopeful emotionally that, one day I'll be thinking about it less and it'll be, less anxiety producing. But I just really, take a lot of solace in spending time with other people that have walked this journey, other young women that have been through it as well too, because I think that it's really difficult. I'm a really high functioning person. I'm energetic. I love to be active. I love my job and playing with my kids and having a great social life and that kind of thing. So I think that it really appears to the outside world that I'm doing great. I'm fine. But there's a lot of hidden stuff that's going on, and I have to work on that every day. I still go to regular therapy. I still, seek support from my friends that have been through this. Because, I just don't know that it will ever not be part of my story.
You mentioned your kids there. Your kids were very, very young when this happened. Undoubtedly, they had sort of no understanding of what was going on, but they're a little bit older now. How much do they know about all of this?
So they know that mom had cancer. My daughter was 3 at the time. She turned 4 kind of during my cancer treatment. So she remembers some things. Like she remembers the day that my husband shaved my head, for instance, when I was losing my hair from chemotherapy. She remembers, mom having to go to the hospital quite often. My son doesn't remember anything. It's really interesting. This year at school, they did the Terry Fox run and they wear the little penny flag on their shirt that says, "I'm running for blank." And they both wrote on there, "I'm running for Terry Fox." And I was like, "But you're not running for your mom?" And they were like, "Oh yeah, we forgot you had cancer," right? Like it's not on top of mind, right? And we still talk about when mom had cancer because unfortunately there's other people. We lose people. I lose friends to cancer quite often every few months. There's lots of women I know living with metastatic disease. We lose neighbors, we lose friends, we lose family members. So cancer is often in the conversation, but luckily they don't remember a lot from my personal experience. I
was going to say that's actually kind of a wonderful thing that they wrote, "I'm running for Terry Fox" and not mom, because it suggests they're not traumatized by your experience, and that's great.
Exactly. It felt really good to, at first I was a little bit puzzled. I was like, well, why wouldn't you run for me? But then I was like, they don't actually remember. And that's a really good feeling.
Okay. In our last couple of minutes here, Abba, I want to turn the microphone back over to you and talk about, since this appears to be a growing phenomenon amidst us, what do you need?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. We definitely need support at the government level, at the federal level, and then also at the provincial level to really be able to execute standardization of support for young people with cancer. At this point in time, there's individuals like myself and individual institutions that are able to kind of create program for adolescents and young adults with cancer, but this is definitely insufficient and unfair, really. There should be no geographical, advantages here. And so it's a plea, actually, a plug to both levels of government, all levels of government, really, to put this on their radar and increase support and awareness for young adults going through cancer. Thank you so much.
In terms of awareness, I mean, during the World Series, you've got those moments where people hold up signs saying, "I'm thinking of," and the other night on Hockey Night in Canada, we saw the same thing where people fill in the names of those they are thinking about who are fighting cancer. So in terms of awareness, you got a lot going for you. Abba Gupta from UHN, Timothy Rebick from Harvard University, and Michelle Butterfield. I know every single person watching or listening to this is thinking good, positive, energetic thoughts for you. And we're grateful to all three of you for joining us on TVO tonight. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Last year, more than 100,000 Ontarians pulled up stakes and moved to another province. That level of outmigration hasn't happened in decades. With us on what's happening and why, in Montreal, Quebec, Marissa Colton, reporter at the Financial Post. And here in our studio, Mike Moffat, Senior Director at the Smart Prosperity Institute think tank and an assistant professor at Western University's Ivey Business School. And Sabrina Mado, columnist at the National Post. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. And I should just say, full disclosure, I know Mike. Mike is married to my first best friend in Canada. So I just wanted to put that on the table so everybody knows. But Mike, you're not getting any special treatment.
Okay.
So Sabrina, I wanted to come to you. You wrote a column about this, and people have always moved in and out of their home cities. What makes the recent wave of people in Ontario migrating outwards different?
Well, it's so much bigger, for one thing. Between 2017 and 2018 to 2021, the amount of people leaving Ontario increased by 94%, which is staggering. And a lot of those people are young, and particularly young families, and they're being driven out by affordability issues, particularly in housing.
So you're saying that they moved out because they can't afford to live here anymore?
Yeah, they want to start lives, they want to own real estate, they want to have space to have kids, and that's near impossible to do in Ontario these days unless you got very lucky with your market timing or you have help from family money.
Well, Mike, you and I have kids, and we know that sometimes you just want a corner of space just to drink your coffee. That might not happen. But why are young people leaving Ontario?
Well, it is usually driven by kids. The most common age to leave a city is actually 0. It's kids under 12 months, and you can imagine why. That you have a couple, they're living in a bachelor or a studio apartment in downtown Toronto. Baby's on the way or baby arrives, and they're like, this ain't gonna work. And we've seen that outmigration for about a decade, but before, those families were moving to, say, a Brantford or Kitchener-Waterloo or those sorts of places. But now these high housing prices are all across Southern Ontario. So we're now seeing an increasing number of families move to places like Moncton or Edmonton or Calgary. And they're often able to do that because of the advent of work from home. So now they don't have to be as tied to the GTA as they used to be, that they can now move to a Calgary where home prices are half to a third what they are in Toronto and still work for their Toronto-based employer.
I imagine, too, when you make this decision, it's not an easy decision to leave your community and to move somewhere else. Do you see this trend growing?
Yeah, I do. I think a lot of it will be driven by how much work from home persists. But a lot of times the people who are moving have roots in that area. Maybe their parents or grandparents were there or cousins were there or that kind of thing, which makes it, does make it easier. But yeah, I do see this continuing on just because you look at the home prices in the GTA, now particularly with higher interest rates, young people simply can't afford it. They don't have a choice other than stay in a small studio apartment or move somewhere else where they can have more space.
Marissa, you moved from Ontario and you moved to Montreal the fall of March of 2020. Why did you leave?
So I left again because of affordability issues. I mean, I was just starting out in my career, doing an internship, which would ultimately turn into a full-time job. But, to start, I was, trying to cut costs and, living in the GTA just wasn't feasible. Even though that's where my family is, that's where I'd like to be, the cost was just prohibitive. So I started looking at other options and, Montreal seemed like a great option because I speak French and I had some friends who were also moving down there. From Ontario. So I think it's really, people my age are really trying to just, spend as little on rent as possible. And, Toronto is one of the most expensive cities in the world now. It's just not feasible for people my age just starting out.
How has it been like so far? Any regrets?
No regrets. I really enjoy Montreal as a city. There are, of course, the drawbacks of living away from your family. You don't have that support, and things like that. But it's you're living very, very independently. But I've enjoyed it, and creating a sort of a new life here for myself has been interesting. But yeah, it's always nice being near family. So living away from them is difficult.
I can imagine it's difficult. I guess on the flip side, you kind of like arm's length if there's any kind of drama, right? Right. Sabrina, I mentioned your column. And you talked about this, the Alberta is Calling campaign in your recent piece for the National Post. You wrote, "Actually, I love Calgary. This is a sort of statement that when uttered to other Toronto-based millennials used to earn me blank stares and dubious eye rolls. Most could never see themselves leaving the city for nearby Hamilton, let alone Alberta. Until very recently, such a campaign would have been a colossal waste of taxpayer money, but times have changed in Alberta's favor. The campaign is successfully generating buzz among its target demographic." The eye rolls from Torontonians. I have to admit, I will raise my hand and say guilty. I'm probably one of those people. But who is this this campaign targeted towards, and why those eye rolls?
The campaign's targeted towards young professionals, millennials, and Gen Z who are having huge struggles with affordability in Ontario, and especially when it comes to buying a home. And so the Alberta is Calling campaign plastered Toronto subway stations with these really clever posters advertising how much cheaper housing is in Alberta, how much more affordable childcare can be. One read, smaller rent checks, bigger paychecks, and people are paying attention. Completely unsolicited, I had a lot of friends bring up the campaign to me, saying how much it triggered them to actually think about moving outside.
Triggered?
Yes. Yeah. And not just people who've grown up here, young people who have actually immigrated from other countries to Ontario or Toronto, who find they can't have the lifestyle they expected in Ontario.
Is the campaign working?
I think it's working. They didn't need to light the spark, they just needed to fan the flames, because this affordability issue has been going on for years now, and young people aren't seeing any real solutions or indication that it's going to get better anytime soon.
And the eye rolls, what do you think, what's behind the eye rolls? Is it because everybody wants to live in Toronto and Toronto's like the best city ever? And
I think there's a little bit of Toronto snobbery there. Yeah. And then there's all these stereotypes about Alberta, and maybe it's more conservative or less accepting. But you have to keep in mind, millennials couldn't even see themselves, like I wrote, moving to Hamilton a few years ago. But now they can't afford Hamilton. Now they can't afford outside of Hamilton. So it's opening up their minds to places they might not have considered before.
I want to come back to Alberta's reputation in a little bit, but Mike, you know, it's easier to move around and experience different places when you're single and free. Are we seeing, we talked a little bit about it before, is it more younger families leaving, or is it just younger people, period?
Yeah, so I think we see three cohorts. So one is that younger family where it's a couple usually in their late 20s and early 30s. We are seeing some younger people who get their sort of first job, because what is particularly with work from home, that this has allowed people to do interviews in a place like Halifax or Calgary or Edmonton. So it's also opening up sort of job opportunities to them. So you are seeing that cohort, and you are seeing some older people move out that basically they might be Toronto homeowners, but they can cash out in those properties and move to Saskatoon or someplace, sell a home for $1.3 million, buy a house there for $300,000, and then that million, that's their retirement savings, which they get tax-free.
But there must be some unintended consequences, because yes, you might be moving before you have kids, but once you have kids, we all know that daycare is so expensive. You need that village. So when you leave your home community, you go somewhere else. Are we seeing other challenges coming up when people do that?
Well, absolutely, that you are being away from grandma and grandpa, so you get that sort of not built-in childcare. But I actually think it's one of the things that's driving people out, because Toronto also has the most expensive daycare in Canada. So it's not just the housing, but it's the whole everything involving raising a kid tends to be more expensive in a place like Toronto than, again, some of the places like Edmonton and Calgary that young people are moving to.
Marissa, you mentioned that Montreal was a place that kind of suited your needs because you spoke the language. Are you having any other challenges being in a different province? Or has that made it easier for you to be there?
Well, I mean, there is one drawback about leaving Ontario is the fact that the healthcare situation is a little bit better in Ontario. As you know, in Quebec, they can no longer guarantee that you'll have a family doctor. So It's a little bit more complicated here, the healthcare situation. But overall, I'm enjoying it. I'm enjoying paying less rent. The average cost of a one-bedroom in Montreal is $1,500 versus Toronto, which is $2,500. So, that extra $1,000 that can go toward a lot of different things, So I'm really enjoying just having that extra disposable income. And I would say one of the only drawbacks is being away from home and also the healthcare piece.
The housing unaffordability is something that we've been talking about for a very long time. And I think when you get to the point where you're deciding to leave a place that you've lived in for a very long time to another place because you just can't afford to make ends meet. Marissa, when you were making this decision, who did you not hold responsible, but was there frustrations on policymakers in having you to make that decision to leave a place that you grew up in?
Yeah, it is frustrating, because Toronto would be my number one place to be. It's an hour's drive from where my parents are, and I would love that accessibility. I find that, throughout my early adulthood, I've always had to sort of strike Toronto from the list, even when I was in university, when I was in graduate school, it never was an option because it was difficult to justify. It would have been possible to do, but, on a stretch. So I think that, I do hold policymakers to account. I think they have, a job to do in terms of making housing affordable for, people my age. We can't be expected to pay 50-60% of our income for rent when, in these early stages, it's so important to be saving and paying back student loans and things like that. So I would say, yes, I do hold policymakers to account.
If you got a job in Toronto that paid really well, would you move back?
It depends on the job. I mean, it's so comfortable being in Montreal and paying what I feel is a reasonable rent. Even in Toronto, I just wouldn't feel comfortable, paying above $1,000 if I didn't have to. So I would say it would have to be a really, really good job.
Well, Sabrina, Marissa mentioned being comfortable, not having that pressure, I guess, to, nickel and dime and think about where the money's coming for all the things that you need to get done. Alberta and Nova Scotia have both introduced campaigns to attract remote workers from elsewhere in Canada. Aside from cheaper housing, what are some strong suits that these provinces have over Ontario?
It's not just cheaper housing, but more space, more outdoor space, which people really want after the pandemic. Also, we had talked about cheaper childcare, possibly more jobs for young people in different sectors where they can increase their paychecks. And I think there's just this overall frustration of people, young people in particular in Ontario, where they don't feel policymakers have listened to their concerns. They don't feel politicians are taking the housing issue or affordability seriously. And they think there might be more light at the end of the tunnel somewhere else.
And they're done waiting, I guess.
They're done waiting. You can only wait so long, right? Millennials aren't 21 anymore. They're in their mid-30s. They're pushing 40. These are people with real jobs, careers, hopes, dreams. They want to have families. And eventually, they have to make some tough decisions.
And as we know, with the housing market, every month, every day seems to count. And Mike, as an economist, I'm sure you've thought about this. If these young people are taking their skills elsewhere, what does it mean for Ontario's labor market?
Well, it's a real problem. You get into this real irony that we need to build more homes in this province. And a lot of those people who are moving are electricians and roofers and plumbers, the very people that we need to build these homes. So this is going to be a problem. I think it's a problem. It's November. We've had this QP strike or QP labor disputes in Ontario around the pay for ECEs and janitors. It's the same thing, that if you're making $39,000 or $45,000 a year, these skills are needed in other provinces. So it's a matter of, having those daycare workers and those school workers and the trades workers that make this province work. Those are the people getting priced out and moving to other provinces.
And I don't want to start a debate about generational divide, because I think we're Gen X, and then we've got two millennials and boomers. We don't have a boomers here, but it seems as if depending on the generation that you're in, you see this situation very differently. When we talk about millennials not being able to afford things, just cut down on the coffee, cut down on the avocado toast. But Mike, do you think that maybe this generation and their skills and talents are being overlooked because Gen X and boomers, we had a different situation?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And one of the great things about my job at Ivy is I've spent the last 16 years teaching 22-year-olds. My students' ages never change. And because of that, you see these sort of differences that 10 years ago, the discussion would be, well, maybe I'll stay in Ontario, maybe I won't, but it's going to depend on a lot of factors. My students nowadays, they're not going to stay. And they say that outright, that I don't think I'll ever be able to afford a home, not even in just Toronto, but London or Ottawa or Kingston. They're all planning on leaving, and they feel that they've been cheated. And as that Gen Xer, someone who got into the housing market in 2004, bought a first home for under $2,000, I look at them and I go, yeah, you're right, you are being cheated. Our generation did have it a lot better than you do.
Mm-hmm. And this campaign, Alberta is calling, you touched a little bit about this idea that if you're from like a big city like Toronto, you're like, ew, I will say that even in Toronto, there's like this micro snobbery. When I was younger, going past Dufferin Station was like, oh my God, that's Mississauga. But I've changed with age. I've become wiser. But this campaign, Alberta's calling, is not entirely like a noble campaign to help young people get on the property ladder and to live a better life. According to Global Mail columnist Gary Mason, who you linked to in your column that you wrote, this campaign is needed because Albertans are, what he says, fleeing the province instead. Does Alberta have a reputation problem?
I do think they have a political reputation problem among young people. They feel that they might not fit in with the culture there. I think also a lot of young people just don't know a lot about Alberta. They, have these ideas in their mind and they're worried, oh, will there be art? Will there be culture? Will there be certain types of professions beyond the oil sector? And they're starting to learn more about that. Mm-hmm. In general, definitely they're considering Alberta more.
Yeah, and not to put you on the spot, because in that column, Gary also said young Albertans are leaving Alberta because of lack of diversity and inclusion. And even former Premier Jason Kenney called Danielle Smith's proposed Sovereignty Act a separatist project. Is that something that Alberta should be worried about?
I do think that they should be worried about their reputation across the country, and definitely when they're trying to get more young people to go there. And like you said, it's not an altruistic campaign. Mm-hmm. They want young people, as young people are good for the economy. They fill jobs, and we know the labor market is struggling to fill jobs right now. They inject money into small businesses. They become entrepreneurs. They increase productivity. So it is a really important thing for a province to be gaining young people rather than losing them.
Mm-hmm. I mean, on the flip side, somebody else could say that some younger people who are moving to Alberta may be attracted to the conservative values of the province. Is that fair to say, too?
That could be, too. We see in political polling that young people who historically vote for Liberals or NDP, and they historically lean left-wing, are starting to open up to voting Conservative. And that's because the Conservative Party has been on the forefront of talking about the housing crisis and affordability. If you look at political polling, for both men and women in the 18 to 34 demographic, affordability, cost of living, housing, those are their top three issues in the economy. So this is what they're thinking about first and foremost. And when you can't afford to pay rent, or you can't afford to raise a child or have the family that you wanted, being precious about politics, I think, takes a second seat.
And I've seen you on Twitter we've exchanged moments on this, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, I see this with my 22-year-olds that 10 years ago, my average student was this kind of center-left, kind of Obama, yes, we can, hopey, changey kind of thing. They are polarized now. They are angry. They're upset about, not just the housing situation, but climate change and things like that. You definitely see more of them on the right, but you also see more of them on the left, that there is this sort of polarization and anger out there that I think politicians need to understand, particularly centrists, particularly liberals, going, you know what, we are losing this generation. We need to figure out, how to address, the housing crisis, the climate crisis, which are interlinked, being able to build good communities is going to help us on a whole host of fronts.
Marissa, I wanted to ask your opinion on this too, because sometimes I think we all forget that at the end of the day, we're more alike than different. We all, I think, want the basic, we want a house over, we want a roof over our head, food for our family, to be safe. And do you think sometimes politicians miss that in these discussions?
I would say that my impression as a young person, following politics, I also report extensively on politics. There often seems to be a disconnect with the realities on the ground. They seem very, very, they seem a bit out of touch. So it's hard for people my age to see themselves in these politicians, and we get the impression that the politicians are not necessarily working for our best interests because, the vast majority of the time they're a lot older than us, they're well established, and, they don't seem as relatable these days. We tend to, like in discussions among myself and my friends, there was, we read on Twitter, I believe it was Chrystia Freeland, made a comment about canceling Disney Plus as a way to help the affordability crisis. And, those kinds of things don't land well with people my age because we know it's not a matter of having Disney Plus or not having Disney Plus that makes our lives affordable. It's really big expenses like rent and things like that. So, the comments like that seem kind of out of touch.
Well, Mike, when we talk about leadership, what can this province do to retain the young talent here?
Well, I think a lot of it is building housing, and there's a couple of ways to do it. That first of all, we need more housing for young people, but we also have a lot of seniors in this province what I call involuntarily overhoused. That they live in the suburbs, they have a 4-bedroom house that a lot of those bedrooms aren't being used, or they're being taken over by a small dog or replacement for a child, and they're often looking to downsize, but they want to stay in their neighborhoods. They like their community. So if we can find ways to create more housing for seniors, that might actually be the best thing that we could do for younger people, because it could unlock those existing homes and allow the next generation of families to move into those homes that we built back in the 1970s and 80s.
Are they amenable to that?
I think so. I think both are. I think there are a lot of seniors who are actually quite frustrated with the housing situation, that they see these high prices and they say, well, yeah, but it doesn't really benefit me, because if I sell a house,
where do I go?
Where do I go? It's like, okay, great. It's making my estate worth a lot, but I can't spend that. So I think absolutely that this housing market isn't working for anyone. It's certainly not working for young people, but I think we overestimate how well it's working for seniors as well.
Well, we know that the housing crisis is what's driving many out of the province, but are big cities and other provinces immune to the ever-increasing housing prices? Let's take a look at Calgary. The average monthly rent for a 1-bedroom unit in Calgary rose 10.2% in 2022. According to a 2021 Scotiabank report, Calgary ranks with Toronto, Hamilton, and Kitchener for the least housing supply. Sabrina, do you see maybe people becoming kind of a little bit of animosity to people in Alberta towards the people who are coming into the province?
I could see that for sure. The housing crisis, a few years ago, people thought, oh, it's just a Vancouver problem, it's just a Toronto problem, and then just an Ontario problem. But it's been allowed to expand really across the nation from east to west. Mm-hmm. And especially as high income earners from Toronto who might now be able to work remotely, keep their Toronto salary, and move to another area come in, they are pushing up housing prices and rents. And that can create some animosity. I have family in the East Coast with some young cousins, and they have found their rents or their potential to buy a home has disappeared over the last couple of years. And there is this idea that it's people from Ontario coming in and raising those prices and taking away the housing stock.
It just sounds all broken. And this is something you think about a lot, Mike. You move from one place to another place because you're trying to find a good life, and then you displace the people who are in that place, and then they move. This must keep you up at night.
Yeah, it does, and I call it the musical chairs effect, because that's essentially what it is. And you can actually see that in the home price data. That Sabrina said that it used to be Vancouver or Toronto that were expensive, but in 2015 or 16 it was Kitchener, Waterloo. Late 2016, Brantford gets expensive, then Woodstock and Ottawa. It almost seems like it was something out of a 1950s horror movie. The sort of the blob of high real estate prices. And absolutely, that you hear a lot of frustration in places like New Brunswick, where they go, okay, this home that I could have afforded, or this rent I could have afforded, I can't anymore. And you do see literal displacement. You see these homes that are getting rented out. The tenants get renovated evicted and a new family moves in from the GTA, naturally that's going to cause a fair bit of resentment.
And Marisa, when you're thinking about, your life, is it hard to plan a life when you might not know where you're going to be 10, 15 years from now?
Yes, it is difficult. The pandemic has made it so that remote jobs are so much more common. My job is remote, and so making this move to Montreal was easy. But now thinking ahead, I'm thinking, will I end up back in Toronto? Will I end up somewhere else in the world? Will I stay in Montreal? A lot of it at this point, at my age, it just depends on the job and where the job takes me. So I'm sort of saving for some sort of a nebulous goal in the future, putting money toward like maybe a down payment in the GTA, maybe. But it's really hard to plan at this point when people are so mobile, when jobs are remote, when there are opportunities everywhere. People my age, we're just so mobile. So it's difficult to know where you'll land.
We've got about a minute left, and Sabrina, just to build on what Marisa was saying, I think back in the day, our elders, you had one job, you had the pension, you had that community, you could live there 20, 30, 40 years. But what do you think this Alberta is Calling campaign offering young people that they didn't have before?
I think young people are looking for stability, whether it's not getting rent evicted from your rental or being able to buy a home that you can stay in for a few decades and raise a family. Not having that stability really does have a psychological effect, and I'd say it also has a broader societal effect.
In what ways?
Not being connected to your communities, not being as trusting, just being in this constant state of upheaval. And I think that people feel in Ontario, they don't have that stability, and they're hoping to get it somewhere else.
And Alberta is calling.
And Alberta is calling.
Thank you all so much for your insights. Really appreciate your time. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, November 22nd, 2022. Tomorrow, fresh from the Tournament of Champions, Jeopardy champ and University of Toronto grad Matea Roach will be here. Also, sports writer Simon Cooper on his new edition of Soccernomics as people everywhere watch the World Cup. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.